Hello and welcome to a huge upgrade in Workshop Improvement of the Week. I've got an Incra miter sled. I like it except when it's in the way. When it's in the way, it's a little bit annoying and bulky and hard to get rid of. And there's all these other parts that get used with the table saw or near the table saw, push blocks, featherboards, other little items, a fairly big miter gauge as well. And then I've got another drawer with, some other parts and pieces that are occasionally used with the table saw. So I want a place to put those. Here's some unused real estate. Look at that shiny floor, by the way. Unused real estate under my table saw. So I measure it, and I'm going to take those measurements over to the computer. I just made a box around with the basic measurements, the space I've got, set aside some space for casters. I set aside some space for that sled to make sure I've got enough vertical room at the top. And then based on those measurements, I came up with a plan with a little box, simple box with rabbeted ends, 3/4 inch plywood, and I'm going to put some drawers in there. Specifically, there will be 5 drawers. 3 of them will be 2-inch drawers. 1 of them will be a 4-inch drawer and a 5-inch drawer. There's 1/2 inch of space in between each drawer. That leaves room for a 1/4 inch drawer bottom that'll just be screwed on the bottom, plus a 1/4 inch of extra room. The drawer sliders will be flush with the bottom of each drawer, and to plan for that, I took measurements, again in the computer program, to show the space between the bottom of the cabinet and the bottom of each of those sliders. So there you can see I've marked those, and I'm going to use that reference later to cut some spacer blocks to put in the sliders. So that's it for the planning. It's actually pretty simple. Now, when I buy plywood, I can't just go down to a lumber yard and get nice Baltic birch plywood. I just live too far from a kind of a hardwood lumber store. So I mail order it. This is Woodworker's Source. I've never gotten stuff from them before, but it seemed fine. I think they take a 5-foot by 5-foot piece of Baltic birch and cut it up into 6 sections. This is 6 sections of 1/2 inch and 6 sections of 1/4 inch. For the cabinet case, I had some leftover 3/4 inch. I'm cutting it not to the exact length with a track saw, but just close, and then I'll go finish it to the exact dimensions on the table saw. I just find that is a little easier to keep things square if I do that. The box for the cabinet is going to be put together with some rabbets and glue and screws. I'm cutting the rabbets on the router table. I use a straight edge to set the router bit at 0. Then I turn it up 3 turns for 3/16 of an inch, do 1 pass of the rabbet, draw it up another 3 turns for 3/8 of an inch, and that's my final depth of those rabbets. I've been known to cut rabbets on the wrong edge of a board, so I kind of set things together and carefully look at it and then put a little mark where each rabbet is going to go. And here we are cutting the rabbets. I think this is the final length of the rabbets. I don't know which it is, but it's very straightforward, simple process. For assembly of the box, I've got these assembly jigs from Rockler. They're pretty nice because you can really clamp down 3 of the boards and get them in there nice and solid, and then kind of loosely dry fit the last board. You see they've got little, kind of rubbery clamps that go up at the top. They're not really clamps, they're just sort of deals that sort of softly hold the boards in place. But once you get everything lined up just right and really make sure it's square and nice, then all you can just loosen the one board that you're going to glue and screw in. That'll be the front board as I'm looking at this here, and leave the other ones clamped in tight. Then everything goes together nice and tight. So I think these are real convenient. I like them a lot. Here I'm measuring it diagonally to make sure it's square, and it does in fact come out square. The boards for the carcass are 3/4 of an inch, so I'm going to put my pilot holes at 3/8 of an inch, and here I'm just running a little line along 3/8 of an inch. If I had that line, it's just easier to get the pilot holes in the right spot without getting them skewed. I've got to do that on both sides, and then it's just a simple matter of drilling some pilot holes, pulling the board out, adding the glue, then adding the screws, and it's all just very straightforward. There's nothing really special about this. So there's the glue, and like I say, this is really nice with these Rockler clamps, because I know that board's going to go right back in the same spot where I drilled the pilot holes, and everything's going to be nice and square when it goes together. It can just slip right in there, a little bit of nudging back and forth, and you know, it comes out really nice, clean and square. Moving on to the drawers, I decided to use pocket screws. I thought they would be easy, but I really wasn't too impressed. I've used pocket screws a couple times before. This was my most extensive experience with the pocket screws, and I just have to say I wasn't that crazy about them. I clamped the boards together, using a fair amount of force, and it was pretty hard because of the clamp to fit the impact driver in there. And even with the clamping, they moved a little bit when I was driving in the screws. I think that's because the screws are driven at an angle. I don't think there's much that can be done about that. That's just the nature of pocket holes. And despite that, they came out square. The drawers came out square. The second problem, though, I think is really on Kreg, and that is the screws they recommend for 1/2-inch wood are just too long. Now, the reason for that is that 1/2-inch plywood really isn't a 1/2 inch. But I still say it's a Kreg problem, because Kreg ought to know that 1/2-inch plywood isn't a 1/2 inch, and using plywood is very, very common, I think, for pocket screws. So the screws, to my way of thinking, ought to fit undersized 1/2-inch plywood. Just to be clear, I looked up the size of screw on the chart provided by Kreg. That's what they provide for 1/2 inch. You use the 1-inch screws, and the pocket holes are drilled with a little index that comes in the kit, and again, the index is set at 1/2 inch. So there's a solution for this. It's a fairly easy solution. You go to the hardware store and get some M3 washers. I found that the metric M3 ones are the ones that fit best. You slip a washer on each little screw. That shortens it enough that they don't go poking through. So that's the fix. Now I'm going to route in a little handle on the front of a drawer so I can use that to make it easier to pull the drawer in and out. Here I'm using the shaper plate to align a little digital file I made with just a simple shape. There it is, a simple shape for the drawer pull relief. And the shaper plate makes it easy to drop that right in there. I've just got an anchor point right in the middle. I set that anchor point right at the little pencil mark that I made in the front of one of the drawer pieces. And here I am just routing that in. I think I did 3 passes. I also think this is speeded up a little bit, so I didn't quite go this fast. It only takes a couple of minutes because the setup's pretty fast. Once I routed the first handle, I took the whole thing over to the router table, and I'm just going to use a pattern bit in the router table. I think it's a 7/8 inch Amana flush trim bit. It's a really nice kind of all carbide with a shearing action on the flush trim. I just put some double-sided tape, taped the one drawer front that I routed out with the shaper onto a blank drawer front, and then it was quick and easy to just route those out with the pattern bit. And you'll see that it just goes pretty fast, a lot faster than what I was doing on the shaper. So that's a worthwhile thing. The shaper is great for getting that first one, and if you've got multiples to do, a pattern bit I think is faster and more convenient. So with that, there's a stack of drawers. I haven't put the bottoms on those yet. I'm about to show how I put on one of them. You know, it's pretty simple. I just line it up. First off, I put a line on it that's a 1/4 inch. That's just to line up my pilot holes. And I just make sure I've got that bottom lined up with the front, since that's what I'm going to see. I put one screw in one side, go over to the other side, pop in another screw. At that point, I can go through, drill the mark for the rest of the pilot holes, drill the rest of the pilot holes. Once I've got the pilot holes all drilled, I take the 2 screws out, add some glue, and then just screw them back on there. And I'm not going to show that whole process. Next, I'm just going to use the pattern bit again to clean up that little bit of extra edge that was sticking out from the bottom, you know, just because of the way the pocket holes didn't perfectly line up. So they're still square corner to corner. I guess, you know, they're a little bit narrower where I'm routing away some of the excess of the bottom on the drawer, but that didn't seem to affect the way the drawers fit in. Okay, so here's where I'm going to use those measurements I took on the computer to make some spacers to set the drawer sliders in at the proper height. I'm starting with the top one. I've just got 2 spacers. I'm just looking at it to make sure they fit. You can see I've drawn a line an inch, a vertical line an inch from the front of the drawer box, and that's where I'm going to put the sliders. So once I have the top one done on both sides, I cut the spacers down to the next height. Here I'm going to bring in a drawer and just make sure that I haven't made a mistake. Is there, you know, the right amount of room? Yeah, there is. I'm still going to have that 1/4 inch of clearance once I mount that slider. And you just mount the rest of the sliders that way by cutting the spacers shorter and shorter as you go. I have a different color slider at the bottom. It's the same size. I just ran out of the one brand. So I put the sliders in from top to bottom. The drawers go in from the bottom to the top. So I put some spacer blocks in, you know, a 3/4 inch block followed by a 1/4 inch block, because that will get the drawer at exactly the right height for the bottom drawer. I just put some little marks on there at that 1 inch mark so that the sliders will be lined up to the 1 inch. I put in 2 screws on each of the sliders, so they're now in place. I think I actually drove some of them by hand. I can't remember if I used the impact driver on this one or not, but in any event, you put in a couple of screws on each side, then you can pull the drawer completely out, put in the rest of the screws on the slider, reinsert the drawer, and once you've got the first one all done and still sitting on its spacer block so it's nicely supported, the next drawer will just get stacked on top of that with a 1/4 inch spacer, so it will also be at exactly the right height. And here I think I'm pulling out the bottom drawer so I can put in the rest of the screws, and that'll just get popped right back in once it's fully screwed up. So there it is, and works just fine, fit just fine, and it's got that nice 1/4 inch gap at the bottom because that's the spacers I used. Here I'm putting back in my 3/4 inch spacers, then my 1/4 inch spacers. I'm going to pull out the bottom drawer so it's supported and pile the next one on top of it with another 1/4 inch spacer between there. So this worked really well. I'm just going to show how I lined up the second drawer, and you know the other ones are exactly the same. You just end up with a stack of drawers all pulled out with spacers in between them, and that allows you to attach those sliders one at a time, and they line up quite well. I do have to make sure and do that little 1-inch pencil mark at the front of each drawer so that the sliders, line up with the cabinet box. So the drawers and cabinet box face will be aligned when that's all done. So I won't show you all of those. That's the finished one. All the drawers look fine. They all have that nice 1/4-inch spacing between them. Some of the screws I used were a little long. They poked through the 1/2-inch plywood. I just dremeled those down. That's no big deal. For the casters, I was going to try to use some lag screws, but the lag screws I had were too long. Even with a stack of washers, it would have been ridiculous, and the lag screws still would have been too long. So instead of that, I used some button head cap screws that I'll just put in the other direction, so the button head is inside the cabinet and the nut on the outside. That will just make it, frankly, easier to drive those in. And the dark line I showed there is the 3/4-inch thick plywood. So these go in just fine. The bolts I had were just long enough to pick up the nuts. I used nylock nuts for them. I happen to have some, and it's nice that those won't come undone even if there's some vibration. But honestly, I don't expect to use the casters that much, but if I need them, I'll be able to move this thing around. I'm almost done now. Here I am. I'm going to test fit my slider and make sure the slider fits on there. The sled, the miter sled. It fits in just fine, so that's a nice convenient place to keep that. But I'm not quite finished. I want to put a little French cleat on the end, so I've got a place to hang the miter gauge. I cut out, here I am just kind of test fitting, it'll fit there. I just used the shaper to cut the end of each of these French cleats. Then I'll just cut the rest of them out using I think I used the band saw for the rest of that, just again because it's faster than routing with the shaper. So that fits right on there, and that's a nice convenient place to keep the miter gauge. I'm more than happy with the way this project turned out. It really cleaned up the top of my table saw. I've now got convenient storage for all those little bits and pieces. I really think this is kind of my second best workshop improvement, right after the dust collector. If you like this, please hit the like button and subscribe if you'd like to see these videos in the future. Thanks very much. Bye.